Hi, I'm John Stevens,
This is Matt Russell.
and this is Pod Have Mercy.
This is Pod Have Mercy.
So, every time I start the podcast with, well, hey, Matt,
Hey, John.
how have you been? It's like, that's our standard opening.
Saturday Night Live podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how are things in
Good,
the
good,
Russell
John.
household?
Just
I hope
perfect,
we're good.
perfect.
Good. That's
I'm
good.
a perfect father, a perfect
Good.
husband,
That's
John.
good. So good.
Just walking in victory.
How are you doing, really?
Yeah, I'm good. I think coming kind of post Christmas and New Year's, it's good to kind of get underway, and yeah, things are good.
Well, I hope you had a great New Year's.
Dude,
A COVID New Year's.
yeah, it was a very COVID New Year's. We hunkered down and we're with each other, and we're starting a second season, aren't we? I mean, this is
Part 2.
COVID part 2.
COVID part
part
2.
two.
COVID 2021. You're on the mic too, aren't you?
I am.
Oh, good. Thank you, Jeff. COVID part 2.
How are you doing?
Well, it's interesting because we took a long break after Thanksgiving, and we jumped right back in. But instead of like catching up, we went straight to Mark Boom,
Right.
which was probably the right move. I think
Yeah.
that's the baller move.
It is, and he is amazing.
Yes,
I mean,
but we didn't get to like debrief about just holidays and
just life.
just life.
Yeah.
I was really glad that 2020 left and 2021 came. I was so ready for 2020 to be over. On a diet, life change, exercising, and I'm entered into a dry January, which was really good to me. That lasted until the 5th, or about the night of the 5th.
It's like what Mark Boom said
Yeah.
about John. Why would I do that?
Yeah, January 6th, I decided that dry January was not going to be a thing in 2021. It's like what's that meme when 2020 says, "Do you see what I did?" and 2021 goes, "Hold my beer." We're not even 5 days in, dude, and I'm going to show you how I can mess stuff up. I mean, you talk about bad.
Right.
So, great. I mean, if you didn't think things could get more divided and more controversial and more on edge, people are scared.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we're seeing kind of things come to, the surface and a boiling point that really it requires something else from us, really requires, I think, the things you're talking about in the sermons and the way that the church is called to stand in the midst of this world and call us to a different way of reacting and acting is really important. This is real stuff now, right?
Yeah.
This is like our spirituality is either going to work for us or or it's not.
We were talking earlier about how we tend to separate so many things. Like there's these social things, and then there's our faith things, right? And Christians are in this world, and maybe it's our own fault, because I'm very careful that from the pulpit that you don't engage in partisan politics, because it's only a one-way conversation.
Right.
It's not fair. Now, issues around justice or racism or things that are just, we know, are like violence.
Yeah.
Right? That was easy. So last week I can stand up and say we condemn violence in whatever forms that they present themselves, whether it's in the Capitol or whether it's in the streets of Michigan for Black Lives Matter protest, or whether it's Capitol protesters' election. Violence is to be condemned, period. I don't think we have to debate that. I mean, maybe we do. Maybe, but I don't, for me. And as I look at the way of Jesus, that's something that every single person should be able to condemn. When we say, what are our baptismal vows? That I renounce the forces of wickedness, resist the evil powers at work in the world, and repent of my sin. We have to be able to name the wickedness and the evil.
Yeah.
And I think Christians can say racism is a sin. Violence to solve a problem is a sin, especially unprovoked. Right. There's a difference between you defending yourself, right? But this sort of thing it's a travesty, and it scares people. A guy walked out of church Sunday, And he was somewhat in tears, and I said, "Are you okay?" He goes, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
There's a guy who lives in Houston, Texas.
Yeah.
He's not out there. He's just afraid. He's afraid for his own safety and for the country.
Yeah.
That broke my heart.
I think that's really important to really at least acknowledge and to attend to the fact that most every single one of us is sitting on reservoirs of fear right now. And I don't know what it means then for the core message of the gospel over and over and over and over to speak into that kind of utter chaos and say, fear not, right? That's something that Jesus says even into the days that we're in. So how do we move as if fear does not have the final say, but this deep sense of fidelity to the way that God operates within the world?
So this coming Sunday, I'm going to preach. We're in our stewardship of gift season. By the way, turn in your estimate of giving card if you haven't done that yet. And this John chapter 12 passage is fascinating to me because Jesus tells this story of unless a grain of wheat is buried into the ground, dead to the world, it is never any more than a grain of wheat. But if it's buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to life just as it is destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. If anyone wants to serve me, then follow me. Then you'll be where I am, ready to serve at a moment's notice. The Father will honor and reward anyone who serves me. I don't know if you know this, but I used to watch the old Discovery Channel, National Geographic. My wife used to call me Discovery Channel man because I was filled with useless, information. But I remember when they opened up these pyramids, and they would pull out these sarcophagi, right, 4,000 years old. They found seeds.
Yes.
3,000 to 4,000 year old seeds. But they were still just seeds. They'd never been planted, never germinated, and never had done anything beyond that. And it's like we were talking about.
Did they plant them? Could they plant them?
Now you're asking a question that's outside of my
outside of the Discovery Channel's purview.
Yeah. No, now you're asking me a question I don't know the answer to. I don't like not knowing the answers to questions.
That's so interesting.
That is interesting.
No, but it's archaeologists find these seeds sometimes old as 3,000 or 4,000 years old in these tombs, and the seed is still lifeless because they were never planted in the soil. They never died the death necessary to bear fruit and be productive. And it's interesting when you look at this passage is that the whole world is coming to Jesus. The Pharisees even, right before this, they said, look how the world is drawn to him. And then in the beginning of that passage, these Greeks are coming into town.
Right.
And they're like, where's Jesus? Who's son Jesus?
Yeah.
So it just bears hey, they're right. They have a reason to be afraid. You would think now, if this were me, and I'm just now hitting my Taylor Swift fame and fortune moment, right? Now the whole world is coming to me.
Hang on a second. Let me just get you.
No, not Taylor Swift.
That image.
Yeah, exactly.
There you as Taylor Swift.
Shake it off.
And there it is. Okay, go ahead, John. There it is.
So I'm thinking if I'm ascending, right, and all of a sudden now I got worldwide stature, the last thing I'm going to do is think about talking in terms of
death.
Yeah.
Giving up.
The context of the whole world coming to him, and now his response in this pivotal hour is not to consolidate control, not to aggregate the power, not to grab and collect, and it's to give away.
Yeah. This is your best life now moment, Jesus. Don't fumble this, right? And then he is like, what's the answer? You must die to self.
He takes the posture of diminishment.
Yeah.
I must become less. so that you might become more. And I find that fascinating because that is not how I would have responded.
No, I think that's why the spiritual is so helpful to our own human nature, because human nature says, I don't have to die. I can create a bypass. I can somehow get around this. And Jesus, it seems as if suffering is not antithetical to the purposes of God, of divine presence.
You don't have to die. Don't you remember, what was the guy, the baseball player, where they cut his head off and put it in the frozen chamber?
Huh?
Ted Williams?
Okay.
Mickey Mantle?
I don't see where you're going with this, but keep going, John.
No, I'm just saying, when you're talking about people don't want to die.
Yeah, they want to cryogenically freeze themselves.
So if I freeze my head someday, like, they can bring me back.
Is that the equivalent of burying seed in a sarcophagus? The modern day version?
Oh no! It's like any metaphor. If you push it too hard, it starts to collapse.
It just gets absurd, collapses on itself. Yeah. Thank you, Jeff, for pushing it.
That's why it's always
to the
great.
Collapse.
It's always great when you use metaphors with very literal people.
Yeah.
Like, well,
wait a minute.
Well, what happens if so and so? I was like, all right, dude, you're messing the whole thing up. It's supposed to be like a fun little illustration. It's like, jeez.
But there is, I love that. At least what I hear you saying is that here Jesus kind of comes and says, you want to know the nature of reality is that death and you being placed in the ground and another process taking place is part of it.
Yeah.
You can't be free. You won't live into your God intended purposes if you don't endure this, if you don't go through this.
So I think so. This earlier today in our staff meeting and development, I was talking about how anytime you become the center of things around which all other things orbit, when you make yourself the primary reality of things, rather than the reality becoming the primary reality, you basically are just like entering into this space of mediocrity. You think you're entering into the space of greatness, but you're really not. Huh. And this is one of the reasons why the studies have shown that very charismatic leaders have to be really careful, because sometimes they're not as successful as less charismatic leaders, because everything has to be about them. Or sometimes people are too afraid to bring the truth to them.
That's right. They
won't tell them the truth.
Yeah. There's a principle in AA that says principles over personalities, right? That we understand that our personalities can get in the way. It can lead us down roads that aren't helpful. So we put the principles above personality. And I think that's right.
Yeah, so Winston Churchill, very charismatic leader, right? Yeah. He formed, during World War II, this group, this office called the Statistical Office. And it was separate. It was not under any other agency of the government. It only answered directly to him. Okay. And he put the certain kind of people on there that would give him the brutal, honest facts. Because he always had this sense of hope. He said, we're going to make it, we're going to make it, we're going to make it, stand strong. But he knew that people wouldn't be honest with him. He knew that their people were going to just come tell him what he wanted to hear. And he knew that he had to sort of have a sense of honest, brutal facts in order to be successful. Wow. I think what we find in the world today is, I don't know that we really want the honest facts. I don't even know that we know what facts are anymore.
Right?
I mean, I can't, I was in a conversation the other day. So, there was an election. There's all this talk about fraud, and there's this. And, man, it's been very controversial. All right. People just, if people think it was fraud, there is nothing you can tell them that convince. And if you even introduce a different point of view, they get mad at you. They cut you off. And same on the other side. And, I know Georgia was big in the news, a part of this, from there. I don't know a couple of these players like one-on-one first name basis, but I know people who know them well, right? The guy who was running for Senate on the Republican side was a member of my church.
Okay.
So I say, I know who these people are, right? And they're honest people. They were Republican people. They lost the vote. They lost the election. Their team lost. But man, all of a sudden now it's like nothing they say is truthful. It doesn't matter what the facts are. And I wonder how can we get to a place or a space where we can not only be able to share truth but hear truth Because what makes me nervous
Yeah.
is that if we are headed to a place, I think we're already there, but if we're headed to a place where there is no truth, what does that mean for the gospel? Because,
Yep.
you know, part of what we do in this podcast is think, what does the church look like in the
future.
world that we live in the future is this new realm.
Right.
Well, if we now live in a culture that discards truth, facts or whatever I believe, and I don't need any proof, I don't need to have that vetted out in a court of law or
Right.
produced in any other way other than I put it on social media, therefore it is.
Right.
I think, therefore I am.
I post, therefore it is. Yeah.
That's the new Descartes.
Yeah.
It's Russell.
No, don't. I don't want to be known for that.
Russell.
But it does seem that that is a real issue, right? That if it's all just up for grabs, right? So I think like part of our Wesleyan heritage says, and again, kind of part of the my own experience in the program of recovery says that it's our experience, strength, and hope is the only thing I can share, right? So I can share with you my experience. You can share with me your experience, and hopefully the connector around that is, as you've said a couple of weeks ago, is empathy. Something I've been really thinking through a lot in the last few months is this idea of curiosity. And you kind of let those two things dance together, empathy and curiosity, you might have a way forward, right? And then, because then I can ask you about your experience. Tell me more about that. You know, I can, it's the Ted Lasso-ing of, you know, it's like the not being judgmental, but being curious.
Well, and so if we wanted to have a conversation and just say, diagnose, how did we end up where we are? There's hundreds of reasons, but one of them has to do with how we interact with truth, how we listen to truth and receive truth, and how we share truth. Well, there's a couple of things, just three things that I shared. This is actually not from me necessarily. This is actually from a guy named Jim Collins. Good to Great.
Good to Great.
When he talks about making this transformational shift, the first thing you have to do is confront the brutal facts. You have to be honest, right?
Okay.
And so leaders and individuals who are unable to confront the brutal facts are unable to engage in transformational or transitional shifts in their life.
Yes.
Right? And so he said, the first thing you do is you lead with questions, not answers. This to me is like, this is dialogue. This is like, everybody leads with answers. No one leads with questions anymore. It has been my experience. You use questions to gain understanding, not as manipulation or blame or put down. I always love it when I see people's comments section on Facebook. I've always said, you know, that's where the devil lives, is in the comments section on social media.
Actually, that's true, right?
It
the
is
actual
true.
embodiment.
It's totally true. If you want to see evil
of the
incarnate,
satanic
go
forces
to the comments section
been
of people's
released.
social media accounts. But I always think it's funny when people, like, their smart aleck snarkiness, they ask questions. So what do you think about this? So what do you think about this person? So well, what about this and this and this? Like, you're not really asking a question to gain any understanding. You're asking a question to shame. You're asking a question to manipulate. You're asking a question to put down. You're asking a question to coerce.
Right.
You're not asking a question for a question's sake.
Yeah.
So I'm like, don't ask that. You know, don't be a smart butt and do that. Just say what you want to say. If you're going to use questions, I think, how do we help gain understanding? How do you go sit down with somebody who has a different point of view than you have and say, help me understand your point of view? Not with your mind made up that they're wrong, not with your mind, not anything, to really learn.
Yes.
I want to understand.
Yes.
We went through this last year on the podcast of bringing people in like Christian Washington or Cleve Tinsley or other voices to say, look, I don't understand your experience as a black man, and especially in light of what's going on in this country. And I never will, even if you explain it to me. But I can at least listen, and you can help me understand why it's so important for people to march, why it's so important for people to protest, why is it so important for people to kneel or do these things.
Right.
Because I don't have that experience. I don't understand. Now, I can go straight to condemnation. That's the easy route. And that's when you're talking about there's no curiosity, there's no growth, there's no transformation if you're not willing to hear the truth from their experience.
That's right.
Or to just discount it.
That's right. That's right. And some of those questions in, begin to dislodge us from the way that we think the world is, because the way the world is provides me with a lot of security. And if you bring other information and says, well, have you thought about this? Thinking about that may just be disruptive, right? And I cannot be disruptive if I'm not in a safe space. I can't grow. Does that make sense? So if these relationships that you're talking about, to say they really need to start with question, they need to start with empathy, they need to start with a kind of a relational container where it's like we can ask these things. Then when I'm disrupted, I might be able to say, oh, I never thought of it that way. I never saw that. Then I'm not as likely to constrict back in these old ways of thinking or these former ways of thinking that provide a lot of security for me. You know, and if it is true that we're sitting on a lot of fear right now in our culture, then we need to have these kinds of safe spaces that you're talking about to be disrupted.
Well, then he also says the second one of the three is engage in dialogue, not debate, or a dialogue and debate, not coercion. He said people who are led by love refuse to begin with the answer for how to get somewhere.
Yeah.
They play the role of moderator in a series of dialogues that lead through. I always loved, and I don't remember where I got it from. It was in one of the organizational books, leadership books, about the difference between dialogue and discussion. And if you take the root of the words, dialogos means the word passing through. So the word, when we have a dialogue and I speak, the words pass through you. It means you receive them, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the word discussion, the root is cushion means to shake. Means to break apart. So when you think about percussion,
or
right,
concussion,
a drum or a concussion, you are shaking the brain with shaking.
Right.
Concussion,
and a lot of this discussion,
concussion
shaking.
literally in the Latin means with shaking. Right, so a concussion of the brain or a concussion of the heart. So, and that's just like, this is what I'm doing when I'm having a discussion. Right? There's no dialogue there. That's why I think social media is not a great place for dialogue.
No.
And I always tell people, if you have a very difficult message to communicate with someone, conflict to be dealt with, hard message to receive, don't do it by email.
No.
Don't do it by social media. Don't do it by... pick up the phone and call someone. Go sit down and have coffee. Well, you can't do coffee now, but I mean, you could.
You can social distance in 6 feet and do that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. There seems to be something poetic about that, John, because the dialogo seems almost like this dance, this almost this song that happens between people. It's the thing that you hope happens, that there's this like deep connection, that something deeper is going on besides the words. With discussion, the way that you're defining that, it seems like I'm trying to jam words down your throat. Where in the dialogos, there seems like it's about getting you. It's about being received and receiving, and then there may be something deeper that we can move towards.
Yeah, and then the last one is the ability to get to truth. Right, all three of these are about sharing and receiving truth, right? The third one is conducting autopsies without blame. That means in any situation that you have, whether it's a mistake you made or an interaction that went sideways or whatever it is during the day, there's a spiritual discipline of contemplating your action for the day.
Yeah, kind of like the examine.
The examine. Yeah, I mean, that's the fancy word. You always have the fancy words. The examine, at the morning examine and the evening examine, where you're thinking about what went on today. That to me is the conducting of an autopsy on the day. And so we got to be able, as a Christ follower, you got to be able to admit mistakes when you're wrong instead of hiding them. For us, we know, like, you go to the Catholic Church, we don't do this, but that's confessional. To be able to articulate my wrongdoing to someone, and for someone to say to me on behalf of God, right, you are forgiven.
You're forgiven. It's powerful.
Yeah.
It's like massively powerful. That, and I hear you saying that's the direct result of kind of doing these inventories, of taking stock of our day, of how we acted, interacted, reacted, and then putting that, like, in the light of God's presence, saying, oh, I could have done that differently, because that's leading me away from my intended purpose, from freedom, from these kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, and you're never going to be able to hear truth if you feel like you always have to assign blame. And
Hey, that has not worked in my marriage. I'm just saying, John. I don't know about yours, but I'm just signing blame.
yeah,
There's not been a real intimacy.
and this is
Stoker.
this is one of the breakdowns for me. It's one of the breakdowns in our culture, in our society, especially in politics.
That's right.
And around political issues, because okay, first thing I hear from people when we see this Capitol insurrection, whatever you call it, a coup. I mean, they're disrupting the constitutional process of this, first branch of the government, the legislative branch, right? So you probably can find really hard words to describe that. History will name that.
Yes.
But I heard people, the first thing they wanted to do was point to last summer. Well, what about those looters?
Right.
I mean, really. And I was like, can we acknowledge this? Yeah, that's wrong too. But can we name this or no? And why not? Why would we not name this and name that? I mean, immediately when I hear, first thought I think of is this is white people and those black people. I mean, I don't know that that's the reason, but it makes me scratch my head. These are Trump supporters and these are not Trump supporters. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Yes. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
But there's something that causes us to say, oh, yeah, well, look at them.
It's the same thing that I dealt with as a kid that my kids are dealing with when I come and ask my son, hey, tell me about this. And the first thing is, well, my brother, we're not talking about your brother.
Well, it diminishes, it lessens the effect of my wrongdoing. My wrongdoing can't be as bad. I mean, if I'm going to put myself up there. If somebody doesn't like, I'm just going to say, well, let me tell you about Matt Russell.
You want to know a guy with real problems.
And that's
I'll
going to make
that. I mean,
and that's going to make me look a lot better. You know what I mean? I don't have to deal with,
That's why I'm here, because I'm making you look better just out of my own junk that I can't get straight in my life.
That's why I brought you on staff, because it wasn't working with Joseph. Joseph Clam is just too clean.
I know. He's an amazing guy. You got to bring some guy who can't get his stuff together.
I needed another pastor with baggage. You got a lot of baggage. That was the part of the job description requirement. It said, looking for a pastor who can engage in the community and has lots of baggage.
We know one.
And there were a lot of people around the room go, Matt Russell.
Matt Russell, do you know Matt? I think you're right,
you're
though.
An angel, Matt
the inability for me to look at myself really is an entrenched pattern that leads to my own my lack of freedom, my own inability to connect with God's presence. And I think that's why part of the first step of any movement towards God is a step towards reality where I surrender. That's always a step of saying, oh, I have things in my hands that are not going to be useful in my moving forward in life. It may be judgments, it may be characteristics, it may be the way I hold personal things. I have to look at those things, take inventory, and surrender. And I alwaas think that's the movement towards liberty, towards God's freedom, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, last thing, I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
So we're talking about truth, and I'm thinking, of course, the church to live and exist in the world we live in, and to be an influence in the world that we live in. How do we engage in this dilemma of truth? I mean, how do we engage in that? Yeah. That's a question that I have. What is it? I think that we stay focused on, our primary mission and calling, but, there are things that are happening in the world that I just wonder. I think a lot of people in the world look at the church and say, where is your voice on a lot of things?
Yeah.
And what do you have to speak? I think for so long we have not spoken into things we probably should have, and we've spoken into things that we had no business speaking into.
That's right.
And so now people don't know what to make of the prophetic voice. You know the thing about prophetic voice, I learned that if you are a church that only speaks prophetically to one side and not the other, you're not prophetic, you're partisan.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the prophets are always calling the entire nation to a different way of being in the world, not just a couple tribes, right? Mm-hmm. So when God shows up, when Yahweh shows up in the voice of Isaiah, it is woe to. It's all of y'all. It's all y'all, in that sense that that has the opportunity to take inventory, because we're here not because there's certain tribes of people that have done certain things. We're here because of our own human construct and way of being that can do it differently.
Yeah,
that can live in God's freedom in a different way.
All right. Well, tomorrow is the inauguration.
And this will have dropped after the inauguration,
Yeah,
right?
this will be on Thursday.
Oh, yesterday was the inauguration.
We're coming to you from a bunker.
Yeah,
I don't know if we should even talk about yesterday, because who knows what's going to happen. We might be like, hey, it was great.
So as you're listening to this,
if you can hear this,
no idea.
Radio Freedom on frequency 849.
So I am very hopeful.
It's Red Dawn.
That there will not be any problems. You went straight to Red Dawn.
I did. Do you remember? Did you watched Red Dawn?
No, I knew that. So the Soviet Union was always the bad guy in the movies.
In the good old days.
Back in the good old days.
Back in the good old days.
And now our children go, Dad, what was the Soviet Union?
Right. My son asked me today, so you lived during the Cold War? Yes, son, I did. It wasn't that cold. I was in Dallas and it was pretty hot. Yeah.
Well, so I'm praying that that everything will be peaceful.
Yeah, I think one of the things that whatever the shift and the change is that our call as a church is still to remain faithful to another kingdom, another way of doing, another way of loving. And so, like you have said before on this podcast, John, that administration and leaders will come and go. The call of the gospel is to continue to call people towards a different way of relating together. And why policy change can help with that, it cannot do the deeper work of what it means to be human together. And we have to do that in small batch ways in our community. That's why I love being a part of this community, because we're attempting to do that the best way we can.
And the only way that we're going to be able to be successful in that is when Christians start behaving and acting like Christians.
Right.
And modeling the ways of Jesus.
Yes.
And not being driven by other loyalties and ideologies and loves, which we say are not higher than Jesus in our lives, but we don't live in such a way that proves that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm John Stevens.
And I'm Matt Russell.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.